In the north of Glasgow, two postcodes sit barely 2 miles apart on the map. Milton on one side, Possil on the other. For most of the last 25 years, the families who came out of those two areas have been at war with each other, and the cost has been measured in funerals, in prison terms running past a century, and in attacks that crossed whole oceans to reach their targets. It started with one stolen stash of a controlled substance worth a few £1,000s back in 2001. It grew into the longest and most notorious gang feud Scotland has ever recorded, dragging in army surplus firearms, a supermarket car park, a beachfront bar on the Costa del Sol, and a string of arrests in the Gulf. 2 generations of leadership rose, and 2 generations fell. The strange part is that both were brought down in almost exactly the same way, by their own visibility. What you are about to hear will show you precisely how it happened. Section 1. 2 postcodes, 1 stolen stash. Where the war began. Drive north out of Glasgow city centre and within 10 minutes you reach Possil. Keep going another 2 miles and you are in Milton. These are ordinary parts of the city, rows of tenements and low-rise housing, shops with shutters, primary schools and bus routes. On a map there is nothing to separate them beyond a stretch of road. For 25 years though, the distance between these 2 postcodes has been the front line of the most sustained gang war Scotland has ever produced. Possil was the home ground of the Daniel family. Milton belonged to the Lions. By the late 1990s, both names were established in the city's underworld, and both had built networks around the same product, the supply of controlled substances across the north of the city and well beyond it. The 2 operations were never going to coexist quietly. They were competitors selling into overlapping territory, and the people running them knew exactly who the others were. The man at the centre of the Daniel operation was Jamie Daniel. He had started out as a scrap metal dealer in Possil, working yards and weighbridges, and he turned that trade into something far larger. By the time his name was known across Scotland, he was reckoned to be worth somewhere in the region of £9 million. The fortune did not come from scrap. It came from the network he built underneath the legitimate front, a distribution operation that moved product through Glasgow and fed money back up to the top. Daniel founded the clan that carried his name and ran it with the authority of a man who had built it from nothing. On the Milton side, the Lyons operation rose through the same decade under Eddie Lyons Sr., originally from Cumbernauld in North Lanarkshire. The Lyons approach had a particular feature that would follow the family for years afterwards. Eddie Sr. took control of a local community centre and used it as a base. To the outside world, it was a facility for young people in the area. Underneath that surface, it functioned as a hub for the group, and the men around it became known by a nickname that stuck: the Club Boys. The name was almost a joke at first. Over time, it became shorthand for one of the most active criminal networks in the city. What turned 2 rival operations into an open war was a single theft. In 2001, a stash of cocaine was taken from a Daniel safe house in the north of the city. The amount has been put at around £20,000, a meaningful sum, but a modest one by the standards of either group. The value was only part of the insult. The bigger problem was where the stash ended up. It surfaced in Milton, and it was sold on by the Lions. To the Daniels, this was theft and humiliation in one move, product lifted from their own premises and then pushed onto the street by their direct rivals. You can trace almost everything that followed back to that one event. A stolen consignment worth a few £1,000s set in motion a quarter century of retaliation, and the retaliation never fully stopped. In the years immediately after 2001, the feud ran as a series of tit-for-tat attacks, the kind of low-level violence that rarely makes national headlines, slashings and beatings, and the occasional shooting that the 2 sides absorbed and answered in turn. The pattern was already set. Every act demanded a response, and every response became the reason for the next act. Police in Scotland came to describe the conflict in plain terms. This was a turf war for control of a share of the country's trade in controlled substances, and it ran for more than 20 years. By the time the courts were finished with it, indictments would formally describe both the Lions and the Daniel groups as serious organised crime groups, a legal label that captured what everyone in the north of Glasgow had already understood for years. These were no loose collections of street sellers. They were structured organisations. Each had its own leadership and its own enforcers, its own ways of moving money and a territory to defend, and they were aimed squarely at one another. The geography matters because it explains why the war was so hard to contain. When your enemy lives 2 miles away, in an area your own people pass through every day, there is no neutral ground and no distance to cool things down. The same shops, the same roads, and the same schools served both populations. A figure from one side could be spotted by the other in the time it took to fill a car with petrol. That closeness gave the feud its grinding, relentless quality. It was always local, always personal, and always within reach. By the middle of the decade, the violence was escalating past the point of slashings and warnings. The stolen stash of 2001 had hardened into something that both families now organised their lives around. Money was still being made on both sides and the operations kept running, but underneath the business sat a debt that could not be settled with cash. Someone, eventually, was going to try to settle it with something final. The two sides had spent 5 years circling each other. In December 2006, one of them walked into a garage in Lamb Hill in the north of the city and changed the war permanently. That garage was called Aparo Motors, and the 21-year-old who would lose his life there was named Michael Lyons. But before we reach that morning, you need to understand how each operation was built, who ran it, and why a Daniel enforcer nicknamed the Gerbil became the most feared figure on either side. Section 2. The Club Boys and the Scrap Dealers' Empire. Stand outside the community centre in Milton in the late 1990s and you would have seen nothing unusual. Children went in and out. There were activities for young people, the ordinary business of a facility in a working-class part of the city. What you would not have seen from the pavement was the second purpose the building served. For Eddie Lyons Sr., the centre was a base of operations, and the men who gathered around it were running one of the most active criminal networks in the north of Glasgow. This was where the nickname came from. The group became known as the Club Boys, a name drawn directly from the community club Eddie Sr. had taken over. The label sounded almost harmless. The reality was a structured operation built around the supply of controlled substances, with Eddie Sr. at the top and his family arranged underneath him. His sons moved into the business as they came of age. Stephen Lyons would in time become the most significant of them. Eddie Jr. was part of the operation too. A younger relative, Michael Lyons, was in the orbit of the group, a cousin who would not live long enough to take on a senior role. Around the family sat the associates who did the work the leadership did not touch directly. Robert Pickett was one of them, a man whose name would surface again and again across the years of the feud. Names like these matter because the war was never fought by the bosses in person. The fighting fell to the layer beneath them, the trusted associates who carried the risk, while the leadership stayed insulated. The structure was deliberate. The further you sat from the actual violence, the harder you were to convict. 2 miles away in Possil, the Daniel operation was built on the same principle, but around a very different figure. Jamie Daniel did not run a community centre, he ran a scrap metal business, and from that base he constructed a distribution network that turned him into one of the wealthiest criminals in Scotland. The scrap trade gave him cover, a legitimate explanation for vehicles, premises, and the movement of money. Underneath it ran the real operation, the importation and onward supply of product across the city. The Daniel network had something the Lyons feared, and his name was Kevin Carroll. Known to everyone as the Gerbil, Carroll was the enforcer at the heart of the Daniel operation, and he carried a reputation that went ahead of him everywhere. He was the muscle, the man sent to collect debts and settle scores. By the time he reached his late 20s, he was regarded across the city as one of the most dangerous figures in either camp. He was close to the Daniel family, trusted, and central to how they projected power. Whatever the Daniels needed enforced, the Gerbil enforced it. The mechanics of both operations followed a familiar shape. Product was brought into the city, broken down, and pushed out through a chain of lower-tier sellers who never met the people at the top. Cash flowed back up the chain. The leadership cleaned what it could and reinvested the rest. Territory was everything, because territory determined who controlled which streets and which customers. When the 2001 theft sent product from a Daniels safe house into lions' hands, it was an attack on exactly this system, a direct interference with the flow of money and the control of ground. There was a feature of both operations that would eventually undo them, and you can already see it in these early years. Both families fought their war in public. The slashings happened on real streets. The shootings happened at real addresses that could be mapped. Every act of violence generated evidence, witnesses, and a trail, even when no one would talk. The two sides were running businesses designed to stay hidden, and at the same time they were conducting a war designed to be seen, because a feud only works as deterrence if your enemy knows who hit them. That contradiction sat at the center of everything. The visibility that made the violence effective was the same visibility that would eventually feed it all into a courtroom. One detail from these years would matter enormously later. The weapons moving through this world were not improvised. When the violence finally turned lethal in 2006, the firearms used were traced back to British Army stock, military weapons that had found their way into the hands of Glasgow criminals. That tells you something about the level both operations were working at. These were groups with the reach to source military-grade firearms and the money to pay for them, and at least one side now had the will to use them on arrival. The slashings of the early years had been a warning. The arrival of army weapons signalled that warnings were finished. By 2006, the circling had gone on for 5 years. The Daniels had not forgotten the stolen stash, and the Lions had not stepped back. The enforcers on both sides were armed and ready. What had been a war of slashings and warnings was about to become a war of firearms, and the first time that happened, a 21-year-old would lose his life on a garage floor. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The money behind all of this was real, and in Jamie Daniels' case, it ran to an estimated £9 million. Before the firearms come into the story, it is worth understanding exactly what that fortune was built on, what it bought, and why a man who started in a Possil scrapyard ended up watched by police for the rest of his life. Section 3. 9 million from scrap metal, the money and the footprint. Drive west out of Possil Park and into Jordan Hill, and the city changes around you. The tenement blocks give way to detached houses set back from the road, mature trees, garden walls, parked cars that cost more than the houses in some other parts of Glasgow. Jordan Hill is a leafy district by Glasgow standards, the kind of postcode where people who have done well move to and stay. In a house there valued at around £400,000, on the morning of July 4th, 2016, 58-year-old Jamie Daniel was no longer alive. Cancer had taken him, and he had asked his doctors to let him come home from hospital so he could see out his final days inside his own walls. He had been the head of one of the most powerful criminal organisations in Scotland, and the address of his deathbed told the story of how far the trade had taken him. Daniel had not started anywhere near Jordan Hill. He had grown up in Possil Park, the rough North Glasgow area that gave its name to the Daniel clan, and his entry into the underworld had been modest. As a boy, he and his brothers were known for stealing car wheels and lifting scrap metal off building sites and abandoned yards. That was the beginning. The scrap trade gave a boy from Possil a way into adult business, and Jamie Daniel turned that small foothold into a legitimate-looking enterprise that he could operate openly under his own name. The scrap business grew. It bought vehicles, premises, weighbridges, a workforce. To the tax office, and to anyone watching from the outside, this was the source of the wealth Daniel began to accumulate. The reality was that the scrap operation sat over a much larger one. Underneath it ran the distribution network that gave Daniel real power, an importation and supply chain that fed product into Glasgow and out across central Scotland. The legitimate business was a roof. The roof gave the real operation cover, and the cover was strong enough to hold for decades. By the time the figure was put on paper, Jamie Daniel was reckoned to be worth somewhere in the region of £9 million. £9 million is the kind of fortune that does not assemble itself from a Possil scrapyard. It is the figure of a wholesaler, a man sitting near the top of a chain that moved very large quantities of controlled substances. The money was the proof. Each asset traced back to him became, in the end, an entry on the receipt of what the operation had earned. You can see what the money bought. There was the Jordan Hill house. There were the cars. There were the resources that a man at the top of a criminal organisation needs to run his own life. And there was the standing in the city that comes from being a name everyone knew. Daniel was not a recluse. He moved around Glasgow as a public figure of the underworld, and his presence in expensive parts of the city was not a secret. Police knew where he lived. Rivals knew where he lived. The Jordan Hill house was both his home and a statement that the boy from Possil Park had made it. The family around Daniel was part of the picture too. His wife, Debbie Mortimer, was 20 years younger than him. They married late, when he knew the cancer was going to take him, and she was 41 at the time of the wedding. His son, Xander Sutherland, was already a known figure in his own right, serving 13.5 years for supplying heroin. When Jamie Daniel was buried, Xander was allowed to attend the funeral from prison, and the moment was captured in a way that summed up the whole family. He carried his father's coffin while chained to prison guards. The grieving son and the inmate were the same person, and you could see the two halves of the life at once. The funeral itself was held at Clydebank Crematorium, and hundreds of people attended. There was nothing quiet or private about it. The event was public, and the people who attended were a who's who of the Glasgow underworld, alongside friends and family. The size of the turnout told you what Jamie Daniel had been. He was not a small-time figure. He was a man whose presence had organised an entire side of a city's criminal landscape, and his absence left a hole that police believed might never be properly filled. The recognition of what the Daniel operation actually was had reached well beyond Glasgow by then. The family name had been used in court documents for years. It had been spoken in the Scottish Parliament at Holyrood, though only sparingly, the kind of acknowledgement that legislators reserve for the most serious organised crime groups. The Daniel family and the Lyons family were what the indictments would later call serious organised crime groups, and that label was as much about the scale of the money as it was about the violence. Operations of this size did not run on small budgets, and here is where the lifestyle started to work against them. Money on the scale Daniel had accumulated is not invisible. It generates a trail. Property records, vehicle registrations, bank movements, tax assessments, all begin to accumulate in the files of officers who specialise in following exactly that kind of trail. The same fortune that proved Daniel's success was the same fortune that made him a permanent target for police across the country. The Jordan Hill house was more than a home. It was an asset sitting at the top of a list of assets that investigators wanted to understand the source of. The footprint extended past Daniel himself. The Possil Park base of the operation was a real, identifiable area, and police understood exactly where the men around the family lived and worked. Premises linked to the operation were known, vehicles were known, the patterns of who met whom and where were tracked across years. None of this prevented the operation from running, but all of it sat in police files, waiting. Every public moment of the feud added another line to those files. Every shooting and every slashing left a record, and over time those records began to form a picture that would land in courtrooms. Jamie Daniel's passing in July 2016 changed the geometry of the war. The man who had founded the family was gone. There was no obvious successor in place when he passed. His son Xander was in prison. His brothers were in their later years and was said by one former associate to have no appetite for the violence the war was bringing. The vacuum was real, and it sat at the top of the family for a period before it was filled. The person who would step into it was Jamie Daniel's nephew, Stephen Daniel, known across Glasgow by the nickname Bonzo, and Bonzo would inherit not only the family, but the war attached to it. What the wealth ultimately proved was that the operation was an operation. A man does not move from stealing wheels in Possil Park to owning a £400,000 house in Jordan Hill on legitimate scrap metal trading. The money was, in the end, the most public piece of evidence there was. It said what the operation was, who it served, and how much it had earned. The same was true on the Lyons side. The The visibility of the success was the visibility of the offences, and both families had spent a quarter of a century making that visibility larger. Years before any of this wealth was buried in Jordan Hill, the war had reached its first lethal moment. On a December morning in 2006, two masked men carrying handguns walked into a garage on Balmore Road in Lamb Hill, and by the time they walked out, a 21-year-old mechanic was no longer alive. Section 4. December 2006, Aparo Motors, the day it exploded. Balmore Road runs north out of Glasgow city centre and out toward Lamb Hill, a part of the city that mixes housing estates, light industry and small businesses lining the route. At number 730 stood a small garage. It carried out MOTs and repairs, the everyday work of a family-run motor business, and it was owned by a man called David Lyons. On the morning of December 6, 2006, the garage was open for business, and three men with the Lyons name on them were inside. One of them was David's nephew, Michael Lyons, 21 years old, working as a mechanic. He had grown up around the family business, and he was on the floor of the garage that morning the way he would have been on any other.
The other two men inside were not strangers either. Stephen Lyons was there. So was Robert Pickett, a man who would surface again and again in the years that followed as a fixture of the Lyons network. The garage at 730 Balmore Road was, in practical terms, a place where the family came and went. Anyone who wanted to find a Lyons in North Glasgow had a decent chance of finding one at the workshop. That was exactly what the men who arrived shortly before the shooting started had counted on. Two of them walked in through the entrance with their faces covered. Each was carrying a handgun. They moved immediately, and they began firing. By the time a gunman left, the floor of the garage looked, in the words used in a later courtroom, like a scene from The Godfather. The description came from David Lyons himself, the uncle who owned the premises and who witnessed what had happened. Michael Lyons had been shot multiple times. He did not survive.
Stephen Lyons had been pursued, shot repeatedly, and left with injuries so severe that the court would later describe them as causing permanent disfigurement and permanent impairment. Robert Pickett had also been shot and seriously injured. Three men shot inside a working garage in the middle of a normal weekday morning, two of them so badly hurt that they were unlikely to walk normally again, and one of them, a 21-year-old, no longer alive on the workshop floor. The motive that emerged in court was not complicated. The shooting related to a claimed debt of £25,000 against the Lyons nephews, a debt tied to the trade in controlled substances. The Daniels held the claim. The Lyons disputed it. £25,000 is not a small sum, but in the context of operations the size of the two families, it was a number on a ledger rather than a fortune. What mattered was that the debt had become a way of restating who controlled what. The shooters had been sent to take 3 lives in one visit. They left having only fully completed one of those tasks, and that became the legal point on which the case was eventually built. Police arrived at a scene that already told most of the story by itself. There were spent casings on the floor. There were CCTV recordings of vehicles in the area. There were witnesses, although in the world the two families lived in, witnesses talking was a separate problem. The garage was a known address. The Lyons name attached to the premises was a known name. The investigation began with a working theory of who would have done this, and it spent the next 18 months building the evidence to prove it. The men in the frame were Raymond Anderson Sr. and James MacDonald, both already operating inside the Glasgow underworld. Anderson was 48, MacDonald was 37. Across the period leading up to the attack, the two of them had been moving between a series of Glasgow addresses, including Talent Terrace and Drumchapel, Iron Grey Street, Inishale Road, and Jerviston Road, and the court would later hear that they had been in possession of ammunition that fitted exactly the type of weapons used in the garage. 5.56mm rounds, the kind associated with military rifles. 9mm rounds, the standard handgun caliber. None of this was held under a firearms certificate. The two men had been preparing themselves with the kind of munitions that did not belong in a civilian context, and they had been doing it across several addresses without any apparent expectation of being caught. In 2008, the trial took place at the High Court in Glasgow. The jury heard the full account of what had happened inside the garage,
including David Lyons' evidence about the masked figures and the way the shots had unfolded.
The trial heard about the ammunition. It heard about the locations the two accused had been using. It heard about the relationship between the shooting and the wider Daniel and Lyons feud. The jury convicted both men of the killing of Michael Lyons and of the attempted killing of Stephen Lyons and Robert Pickett. They convicted them of the firearms offences as well. The sentence that followed was historic. Each of Raymond Anderson and James MacDonald received a minimum of 35 years in prison. At the time, those were the longest sentences ever handed down by the Scottish courts. 35 years is not a number a Scottish judge reaches for without considering what it represents. The court was making a statement about the nature of the act. A planned, masked, armed attack on a workplace, designed to end 3 lives in a single visit, was treated as the most serious category of organised crime violence the system could recognise. The convictions did not close the matter.
Both men appealed. In 2010, the appeal was heard in front of Lady Peyton, Lord Kingarth, and Lord Philip, and the appeal was refused. The judges ruled that the evidence, when viewed as a whole, formed a coherent and consistent picture that pointed beyond reasonable doubt at the two appellants. Each piece on its own might have looked inconclusive, but the pattern across all of it was decisive. 35 years stood. What happened at Aparo Motors on December 6, 2006, changed the war permanently. The 5 years of slashings and warnings that had run since the 2001 theft had ended on a workshop floor with 3 men shot and 1 no longer alive. The Daniels had crossed a threshold the Lyons could not let stand without answering, and the Lyons would not forget who Stephen Lyons' permanent disfigurement was owed to. The retaliation took its time. It would arrive 4 years later in the car park of a supermarket on the edge of Glasgow, and the person it would take was the most feared figure in the Daniel family. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Before the Asda car park, though, the war had its main characters fully assembled, each carrying his own history into what was coming. Jamie Daniel sat at the top of one operation, Eddie Lyons Sr. at the top of the other, and between them stood a Daniel enforcer married into the family itself, a man called Kevin Carroll, known to everyone as the Gerbil. And what he had built in the city by the start of 2010 is what made his loss so costly to the people who had to answer for it. Section 5. What the bosses carried into court. Stand on a North Glasgow street in early January 2010, and the war between the two families looked almost stable. 3 years had passed since Aparo Motors. 2 men were inside doing 35-year terms for that morning. Stephen Lyons had survived his wounds, but had spent much of the time since in Spain, away from the city that almost cost him his life. The slashings and the warnings had continued, but the lethal moment of late 2006 had not yet been answered in kind. Every player on both sides knew the answer was coming. The question was, who, when, and where? What none of them said out loud, but all of them understood, was that the people standing at the centre of the war by this point were not interchangeable figures. Each principal carried his own weight of history into what was about to happen. Jamie Daniel, by 2010, was in his early 50s. He had been at the top of the Postle operation for 2 decades. The scrap business in Postle Park had grown into something international in reach. The fortune that would eventually be reckoned at £9 million was already largely in place. He had not slowed down. He moved between Glasgow addresses and continued to run his network through a small layer of trusted people. To the outside world, he was Jamie Daniel of the scrap trade. Inside the city's underworld, he was the man at the top of the most powerful criminal organisation operating in Scotland. Police across the country had files on him that ran into thousands of pages. He had been named in court documents repeatedly and would continue to be. The recognition was, by 2010, complete. Anyone in law enforcement who needed to know who ran the Postle end of the trade knew his name without needing to look it up.
Eddie Lyons Sr., by the same year, had been running Milton through the Club Boys structure for 2 full decades. He had come up from Cumbernauld in North Lanarkshire and built his hold on the North Glasgow end through a community centre front and a tight family operation. He had lost his nephew Michael at Applero Motors. He had nearly lost his son Stephen.
Robert Pickett, one of the men beside Stephen in the garage that morning, had survived too and remained part of the network. The Lyons leadership had been wounded at the top of its own family by the Daniels, and the failure to deliver a reply had become a problem of credibility, not only of vengeance. A network that could not retaliate for the killing of its own people was a network whose deterrent had broken. Eddie Sr. was not a man who would let that breakage stand. His sons were arranged around him in the way the Daniel layer was arranged around Jamie. Stephen Lyons was, by 2010, the most operationally significant of the next generation. He had spent the years after Applero in Spain rebuilding his health and laying the foundations of a relationship with a Dublin-based criminal syndicate that would, in time, become central to the Lyons' future. Eddie Jr. remained part of the family operation.
The man who had carried the Lyons name into Applero Motors as a young mechanic was buried, and his absence had a weight inside the family that did not lift with time. And then there was Kevin Carroll. By the start of 2010, Carroll was 29 years old and known across Glasgow as the Gerbil. The nickname had attached itself to him years earlier and had never come off. To the outside world, it might have sounded almost comic. To anyone who understood the Daniel operation, it was the name of one of the most dangerous figures in the city. Carroll was the enforcer at the centre of the Daniel network. He was the man dispatched when collection became confrontation, when threats needed to be backed, when the family's authority on the streets needed to be reasserted in person. Across Glasgow, there was a long list of men who had encountered him in some version of that role, and the encounters had shaped his reputation as much as anything he ever said. What made Carroll a more important figure inside the Daniel operation than a typical enforcer was where he sat in the family. Carroll was married to Jamie Daniel's daughter. He was not a hired hand, he was a son-in-law. That single fact changed the calculation for everyone around the feud. An attack on Carroll was not only an attack on Daniel Power in the abstract, it was an attack on the family by marriage. It would be felt the way the Lyons had felt the loss of Michael and the wounding of Stephen, and it would generate a response of the same intensity. The Gerbil was, by virtue of his role and his marriage, the highest value target either side could choose. Around Carroll sat his own circle. A man called John Bonner, 25, drove for him regularly. Carroll trusted him enough to have bought him the car he used, a VW Golf, around 10 months before what was about to happen at Asda. Bonner had himself been shot while sitting in the driver's seat of that Golf, and police told him at the time that the attack had been a case of mistaken identity. The car had been linked, in someone's eye, to Carroll, and the driver had paid for that link without being the target. Ross Sherlock was another close associate. Sherlock had survived an attempt on his life as early as 2006, and he would survive others in the years to come, including in 2015 and 2017. The pattern was visible already. Anyone close to Carroll became a target by proximity, because anyone close to Carroll was a possible route to him. The Lyons knew all of this. They knew where Carroll lived. They knew the cars he used. They knew his patterns. They had spent more than 3 years watching for the right moment, and the right moment was a moment where Carroll could be located, fixed, and reached without warning. The garage at Applero Motors had been that kind of moment for the Daniels in 2006. What was about to happen in a supermarket car park in early 2010 was the Lyons' answer in the same form, delivered with the same patience. By the end of the first week of 2010, the principles of the war were in place. Jamie Daniel sat at the top of his family, more wealthy than he had ever been, more known to police than he had ever been, and about to have his son-in-law taken from him. Eddie Lyons Sr. sat at the top of his family, still bearing the loss of Michael and the wounding of Stephen, and about to deliver an answer that the city would not forget. Kevin Carroll sat in the middle of all of it, doing what he had always done, moving through Glasgow as the most feared figure in the underworld, with his driver beside him and his enemies waiting. The morning of 13th of January 2010 was an ordinary one in Rob Royston on the edge of North Glasgow. until a black Audi pulled into the car park of an Asda supermarket and a VW Golf pulled in behind it and blocked it in. What happened next, and the chain of trials that followed across the next decade, is where the original war was finally entered into the legal record. Section 6. 35 years, then 104. The legal record of the original Daniel and Lyons War did not arrive in one piece. It arrived in chapters across more than a decade in 3 separate courtrooms, and by the time the last of those chapters had been written, the sentences attached to the feud ran into the hundreds of years. Reading them in sequence is the only way to see the shape of what was actually being judged. The first sentencing chapter belonged to Apler Motors. The second belonged to a supermarket car park. The third belonged to a coordinated investigation that took apart an entire conspiracy to kill 5 men. Each one tells you something different about how the feud was finally fed into the system. The first chapter closed in 2008 at the High Court in Glasgow, when Raymond Anderson Sr. and James MacDonald were each sentenced to a minimum of 35 years for the killing of Michael Lyons and for the attempted killing of Stephen Lyons and Robert Pickett. Those terms remained, at the time, the longest custodial sentences ever handed down in Scotland. The appeal in 2010 in front of Lady Peyton, Lord Kingarth and Lord Philip did not move them. The 2 men remained in the prison system, where they have stayed ever since. One detail attached itself to the case afterwards. In 2017, Raymond Anderson's son, Raymond Anderson Jr., then 32, was attacked outside his flat in Talent Terrace in Drumchapel by a man believed to have been armed with a machete. He was taken to Queen Elizabeth Hospital with arm and leg injuries. A 57-year-old woman, believed to be his mother, was also injured. The war found ways of touching the families of the people inside it long after the men themselves had been put away. The second chapter began in a supermarket car park on the morning of 13th of January 2010. Kevin Carroll, 29, was driven by John Bonner to the Asda at Rob Royston. He went inside as he had on other days. When he returned to the black Audi, the car was blocked in by a VW Golf, and masked men were closing the distance. Bonner climbed out of the passenger side, fell to the ground, and ran. The Asda duty manager, Stephen McKenna, came to the window of his office after he heard a bang and saw the scene unfolding. Carroll did not survive. He had been shot multiple times in front of lunchtime shoppers, in daylight, in the middle of a working supermarket, by attackers who had located him, fixed him, and reached him in exactly the same way the Apler attackers had reached the Lyons 3 years earlier. The retaliation, when it came in the shape of the original attack. The legal answer to Carroll's killing took years to build. Ross Monaghan was the first man brought to court for it. His trial collapsed in 2012 for lack of evidence, and he walked. The case did not close with his acquittal. Investigators kept working it. William Patterson, known as Buff or Billy, had relocated to Spain in the aftermath. He stayed there until 2014, when he surrendered to the authorities and was returned to the United Kingdom. In 2015, his trial concluded at the High Court in Glasgow, and he was sentenced to a minimum of 22 years for the killing of Kevin Carroll. Buff Patterson had been a Lyons associate. The pattern across the 2 chapters was now legible in the sentences. Anderson and MacDonald, Daniel's side, 35 years each for the killing of Michael Lyons. Patterson, Lyons' side, 22 years for the killing of Kevin Carroll. 2 of the most significant lives lost in the war, 2 sets of long sentences, 2 chapters of the legal record closed. The third chapter began with an investigation called Operation Engagement, run after a wave of attempted killings between June 2016 and September 2017. The targets across that period were Robert Daniel, Thomas Bilsland, Gary Petty, Ryan Fitzsimmons, and Stephen Daniel, struck at locations across Glasgow, North Lanarkshire, Renfrewshire, and Manchester. The most violent of the attacks took place on the 18th of May 2017, when Stephen Daniel was chased at high speed along Glasgow's road network in his Skoda Octavia, which had been fitted with a tracker by his attackers. The chase ended on the slip road of the M8 motorway at Port Dundas, where the car crashed and Daniel was set upon with a cleaver, a hammer and sharp-bladed implements. His injuries were so severe that police arriving at the scene initially believed he had been shot at close range. His nose had been almost severed from his face. He survived. The other targets were struck in similar fashion. Robert Daniel had been rammed and pursued into a house in Rob Royston on the 8th of December 2016 and struck on the head. Ryan Fitzsimmons had been ambushed outside his family home in Clydebank, West Dunbartonshire, on the 28th of April 2017. He was knocked unconscious after being hit with a knife, a hammer and an axe. The court would later hear that Fitzsimmons was an innocent man, caught up in the war by association, a hard-working person living quietly with his mother, whose brother Martin had earlier been arrested in connection with an attempt on the life of Ross Monaghan outside a primary school in Penilee. The judge would later describe Ryan Fitzsimmons as someone whose injuries had forced him to give up work and become dependent on others. He had been attacked because of a name attached to a brother, and the consequences had been life-altering. The men responsible were caught by what Lord Mulholland called, in his sentencing remarks, good, old-fashioned detective work. The plot had been sophisticated. It had involved high-tech tracker devices fitted to the cars of targets and encrypted mobile phones used between conspirators. What undid it was DNA found on a tracker. Once that single piece of forensic evidence was placed, the rest of the picture unwound around it. The trial at the High Court in Glasgow lasted 14 weeks, much of it under tight security. In April 2019, the jury returned guilty verdicts on conspiracy to murder for 6 men. Brian Ferguson, 37. Andrew Gallagher, 40, known to the network by the nickname Dumbo. John Hardy, 35.
Robert Pickett, 53, the same Robert Pickett who had been shot inside Applero Motors in 2006. Andrew Sinclair, 32. Peter Bain, 45. In May 2019, Lord Mulholland passed sentence. Ferguson, Gallagher and Hardy were each jailed for 20 years. Pickett received 16, Bain received 15, Sinclair received 13 years and 3 months. The total across the 6 men was 104 years. Lord Mulholland told the court that the men had sought to turn Glasgow into a war zone with their feud, that a civilised city based on the rule of law had no place for retribution or the law of the jungle. He noted that Stephen Daniel had given evidence in the trial, denying he was even aware of a feud between the Lyons and Daniel families, and added plainly that he had not believed a word of that evidence, and, more importantly, neither had the jury.
Detective Inspector Jim Bradley, who had led the investigation, told reporters afterwards that it was a miracle no one had been killed during the attacks. By the time the 3 chapters had been closed, the original Daniel and Lyons War had been entered into the legal record at a cost of well over 150 years of prison time across the principals and associates on both sides. Robert Pickett was now in custody for the 2nd time, his earlier appearance as a victim at Applero Motors, followed by his appearance as a conspirator inside the Operation Engagement plot. The war had moved its own people through every available role. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
The chapters closed in 2019 felt like the end of something, with Jamie Daniel gone and the Lions' leadership abroad. But a fresh war was already gathering around a former Rangers ultra in Dubai and a counterfeit payment for a £500,000 consignment of cocaine. That name was Ross McGill, and his crew called themselves Tamo Junto. Section 7. Dubai, the Kinahans, and a £500,000 deal in counterfeit notes. After the May 2019 sentencings, the feud entered a stretch that looked, from the outside, almost like a truce. The 2 families had been bled by long prison terms. Jamie Daniel was no longer alive. Eddie Lyons Sr. had stepped back from the operational front. Stephen Lyons had relocated abroad. The Glasgow streets that had been the front line of 2 decades of attacks went quiet enough that people who had watched the war for years began to ask whether it had finally run itself out. The truth was that the war had simply moved address.
Inside the Daniel family, the successor to Jamie was his nephew Stephen Daniel, known across Glasgow as Bonzo.
Bonzo had been the man whose Skoda Octavia was rammed at the slip road of the M8 in May 2017, and whose face was opened with a cleaver while police arriving on the scene thought he had been shot. He survived, and by the time he became the head of the family, he had already paid a personal price for the name. The founder was gone, the enforcer was gone, but the network remained, and so did the war. On the Lyons side, the reorganisation had happened earlier. Stephen Lyons had spent his Spanish years building a relationship with a Dublin-based criminal syndicate run by Daniel Kinahan. He reportedly attended Kinahan's wedding at the Burj Al Arab Hotel in Dubai in 2021. Eventually, he settled in Dubai himself, where a number of senior Kinahan figures had also based themselves. From a Gulf apartment, Stephen Lyons could direct the Lyons end of the operation while sitting thousands of miles outside Police Scotland's immediate reach. What broke the stretch of quiet did not come from inside either family. It came from a third party on a different continent whose business crossed paths with the Lyons world by association. The third party was Ross McGill, 31, originally from Glasgow, now living in Dubai. Before he became known to police in a criminal context, McGill had been a senior member of the Rangers Ultras group, the Union Bears, a hardcore supporters faction whose senior figures had repeatedly drawn police attention. In Dubai, he picked up the nickname Miami, a marker of the lifestyle he projected from his new base. By 2024, he was involved in the wholesale trade in controlled substances, operating in a loose network that overlapped with the Kinahan world without sitting directly under its umbrella.
The deal that lit the fuse was a consignment of cocaine worth around £500,000, sold to a man linked to Mark Richardson, a senior Edinburgh figure in the trade, who was at that point in prison. The deal was completed at the Edinburgh end by an associate. That associate paid for the consignment on McGill's account in fake banknotes. £500,000 of product had been handed over and paid for, in paper worth nothing. McGill, sitting in Dubai, took the bumped payment as a deliberate insult, a Richardson-side decision to test whether he could be cheated out of a £500,000 transaction from 5,000 miles away. His answer was that any organisation associated with the people who had taken his product for free would pay for it in a different currency. In early 2025, that decision became a new criminal operation.
McGill formed a crew to carry out reprisals against members and associates of Richardson's network, and, by the inevitable logic of how these things move in Scotland, against members and associates of the Daniel family, who occupied overlapping territory in the east-west supply landscape. The crew called itself Tamo Junto, often abbreviated to TMJ, and the name appeared in graffiti and on social media almost from the start. By the spring of 2025, a war that had looked like it might have ended had been entirely reignited from the outside. The new war announced itself in early March 2025, with a car going up in flames on an Edinburgh street, and it did not stop. Within weeks, the firebombings and machete attacks had spread from Edinburgh into Glasgow, Bishopbriggs, Kirkintilloch, Steps, and across to Clydebank, with almost every incident filmed by a doorbell camera before the attackers had left the street.
Section 8. Tamo Junto, firebombs, machetes, and a doorbell camera. On the early morning of March 2, 2025, on an Edinburgh street, a car parked outside a residence went up in flames. It was, on its own, a single fire-raising incident. What followed within 10 days made clear that the burning car had been the opening of a pattern. A beauty salon in Leith was targeted. A garage in Portobello was targeted. Shots were fired at properties in Niddry and Pilton. Within 4 weeks, another firebomb attack had hit a house in Niddry, and on the same day the wave crossed into Glasgow, when a property in Robroyston was attacked. A carpet business in Bishopbriggs followed, then premises in Kirkintilloch, then homes across Glasgow and at Steps. Within months, the wave had pulled in addresses across both the east and the west of Scotland. Police Scotland set up Operation Portaledge in response. Officers visited more than 8,000 homes and stopped more than 1,600 vehicles as part of the investigation. The arrest count climbed week by week, 42 by the end of May, 57 by September, more than 60 by autumn. A police force does not visit 8,000 homes for a problem it considers contained. The men carrying out the attacks were, for the most part, young. Tamo Junto, under McGill's direction from Dubai, was made up of people who could be moved quickly through the central belt and deployed against specific addresses with short notice. They were given vehicles, they were given balaclavas, they were given weapons that ranged from petrol-filled bottles to machetes. The plan was that each attack would be high-profile enough to send a message and low-profile enough to leave no individual operator traceable. The plan failed almost from the start.
Every targeted street in Edinburgh and Glasgow had, by 2025, the same accessory that almost every house in the United Kingdom had acquired over the previous decade: a doorbell camera mounted near the front door. Combined with the wider CCTV that already covered Scottish urban areas, the doorbell transformed what would once have been a discreet street attack into a film shoot. The crews carried out their attacks in front of an audience of small fixed cameras they could not switch off. The point was made most clearly by one detail. 3 young men, Marshall O'Hara, 21, Fraser Stewart, 22, and Aidan McLaughlin, 21, later admitted firebomb attacks on houses and the carpet firm linked to the Daniel family. They had been caught, in the words of Lord Mulholland, by damning CCTV and doorbell camera footage. The footage included one moment where McLaughlin's own trainers caught fire as he leapt from the roof of one of the buildings he was setting alight.
That image of an attacker fleeing his own arson with his shoes burning became the visual summary of the new war. Lord Mulholland called it an example of sheer, naked gangsterism. The most serious individual attack of the wave took place on 22nd of May 2025 on Pitcairn Grove in Edinburgh. A businessman called David Macmillan was targeted. A Land Rover Discovery pulled up, 3 men in balaclavas got out carrying machetes, and Macmillan was repeatedly struck with the weapons before the attackers returned to the car and drove away. Macmillan declined to give a statement to police, but the assault led to attempted killing charges against 2 of the men involved. The driver of the Land Rover that day was Fraser Stewart, the same Fraser Stewart from the firebomb cases. He was jailed for 3 years for his role as the getaway driver. The new war had tried to operate at a higher technical level than the old one, with encrypted messaging, tracker devices, and burner phones. The crew was innovative on the front end and hopelessly exposed on the back end, and the back end was where the cases would be built. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The sentencings of the young men carrying out the attacks were one half of the answer. The other half was the chain of arrests that, in September 2025, would reach the men directing the operation from outside Scotland, in a Gulf city where they had assumed they could not be touched. Section 9. A beachfront bar in Fuengirola, and the war reaches Spain again. On the evening of Saturday 31st May 2025, in the resort town of Fuengirola on Spain's Costa del Sol, 2 men sat in a beachfront bar watching football. The Champions League final was on, Paris Saint-Germain against Inter Milan. The bar was busy. The 2 men had spent most of the evening there, drinks in front of them, eyes on the screen.
One of them was Eddie Lyons Jr., the brother of Stephen Lyons, son of Eddie Sr., and a Lyons family member through and through. The other was Ross Monaghan. The Monaghan name carried weight that nobody at the surrounding tables would have known. 15 years earlier, Monaghan had stood trial in Glasgow for the killing of Kevin Carroll, the Daniel enforcer shot in the Asda car park at Rob Royston in January 2010. His trial had collapsed in 2012. He had walked free. In the years that followed, he had himself been shot, in 2017 while dropping his daughter at school in Glasgow. After that, like Stephen Lyons before him, he had moved to Spain. When the football match ended, the 2 men remained at the bar. A lone gunman walked in. He fired on both of them. Eddie Lyons Jr. did not survive. Ross Monaghan did not survive.
The gunman left, and Fuengirola, which had hosted Scottish gangland exiles for the better part of a decade, became the site of the most significant attack on the Lyons family since the Applero Motors morning almost 20 years earlier. Spanish National Police took up the investigation immediately. Within weeks, they had named a suspect. Michael Riley, 44, from Liverpool, was identified by Spanish detectives as the gunman, a professional hitter brought in to carry out the attack. At a press conference in Malaga in June 2025, a Spanish National Police representative stated that the killings had been the work of a professional gunman acting for the Daniel crime group, the rival faction to the Lions in the long Glasgow feud. Police Scotland's response was measured and qualified. The force confirmed it was aware of the arrest of an individual in the Merseyside area and would continue to support Spanish colleagues. On the question of whether the shootings had been orchestrated from Scotland itself, Police Scotland was explicit. It had, the force said, no current evidence to suggest that the double shooting had been planned from Scotland. The Spanish position and the Scottish position did not fully align. What was not in dispute was what had happened on the evening of 31st May. The two men were no longer alive. The killings sat inside the same feud that had begun with a stolen stash in 2001. The loss to the Lyons family was not abstract. Eddie Lyons Jr. had been the second son after Stephen, an active part of the Spanish-based end of the operation, and the third Lyons name to be taken by violence since the start of the feud. Michael in 2006, now Eddie Jr. in 2025. The senior generation of the family had now buried two of its own. Back in Scotland, the legal chain was already producing its sentences.
The Macmillan getaway driver case had moved through court, and Fraser Stewart was serving 3 years. The firebond cases against O'Hara, Stewart and McLaughlin were running their course at the High Court in Glasgow. Lord Mulholland, who had presided over the 2019 conspiracy trial that put 6 Lyons associates away for 104 years, was now hearing the new generation of cases and using the same language. The phrase he had used in 2019 about Glasgow being turned into a war zone returned, applied to the new attackers with the same exact judgment behind it. Operation Portaledge, meanwhile, kept expanding. Arrests passed 60 in early autumn. A 55-year-old man was charged in connection with the alleged assault on Macmillan. 2 men, aged 20 and 26, were charged with the attempted killing of him.
A 1 September warrant at a property on Margaret Thompson Crescent in Edinburgh recovered a firearm and controlled substances and led to the arrest of a 19-year-old woman and a 43-year-old man. Each individual case was small, but the aggregate was enormous. Dozens of people pulled out of the operation week by week, the foot soldiers of Tam Junto, sentenced one after another inside Scottish courtrooms. What had not yet been answered by the system was the question of the men directing the operation. McGill remained in Dubai. Stephen Lyons remained in Dubai. A handful of other senior figures with links to the wider feud sat in the same city, in the same set of apartment blocks, in what they had treated for years as a safe distance. By September 2025, that distance was about to close. On Tuesday, 16th September 2025, 4 of Scotland's most high-profile organised crime figures were taken into custody on the same day, in the same city. The arrests happened in Dubai, and the 4 names involved would change the entire shape of the case. Section 10. Dubai, Bahrain, and what both wars prove. On Tuesday, 16th September 2025, in the city of Dubai, 4 men were taken into custody on the same day in a coordinated operation that Police Scotland sources later described as significant in ways that could not be overstated. The men were Stephen Lyons, Ross McGill, Stephen Jameson, and Stephen Larwood, an associate of Lyons. 3 of the 4 had been the principal targets of Operation Portaledge for months. The 4th, Jameson, was a senior figure with his own connections inside the wider organised crime ecosystem of Scotland and Ireland. A source familiar with the operation told BBC Scotland that all 4 men were operating at the senior tier of organised crime, with reach extending across the United Kingdom and internationally.
Stephen Lyons was the head of the Lyons crime group, the man who had survived the Aparo Motors shooting in 2006 and rebuilt the family from Spain and then Dubai. McGill was the man whose dispute over a £500,000 consignment of cocaine had reignited the entire feud. Larwood was Lyons' close associate, a man who had moved through the Dubai-based end of the operation alongside him for years. Jameson had his own profile. That profile mattered. Stephen Jameson had links to Jamie Iceman Stevenson, who had been jailed for orchestrating a plot to smuggle £100 million worth of cocaine from South America into the United Kingdom inside boxes of bananas addressed to a Glasgow fruit market. Stevenson, during his own trial, had lodged a special defence of incrimination, naming Jameson among others. The High Court in Glasgow had heard that Jameson's whereabouts at the time were unknown. By September 2025, those whereabouts had a clear answer. He was in Dubai, and now he was in UAE custody. What happened next was less clean than the arrest had been. Within a few weeks, 3 of the 4 men were no longer being held. Stephen Lyons, Ross McGill and Stephen Larwood were released by the UAE authorities. They were reportedly told to leave the country with immediate effect. The grounds on which the arrests had been made and the grounds on which the releases were granted remain shrouded in mystery. Police Scotland made several attempts to obtain information from Dubai and received no detailed response. The chain of decisions that produced the arrests and the chain of decisions that produced the releases has to this day not been made public. Stephen Jameson was different. He remained in UAE custody after the others were released and was later extradited back to Scotland. By the end of 2025, he had appeared in a Scottish court, accused of being involved in serious organised crime.
Of the 4 men taken into custody in Dubai on September 16th, Jameson was the one the system had managed to actually bring home. The story did not end there. Months later, both Stephen Lyons and Ross McGill were arrested again, this time in Bahrain after fleeing Dubai. The Gulf had become smaller. The set of countries that would tolerate their presence had begun to shrink. By the time this script was being written, Stephen Lyons was understood to be in custody in Indonesia, awaiting extradition proceedings to face separate charges in Spain. The man who had spent a decade and a half outside Police Scotland's immediate reach was being walked back into the system from the other direction. Step back from the individuals, and the contrast across the 2 cases tells you what the feud has ultimately been about. The 2006 generation fought with British Army surplus firearms inside a workshop on Balmoor Road, with masked men shooting 3 people in front of witnesses, and they were taken down by old-fashioned police work, witness statements, and a coherent picture assembled across 18 months of investigation. The 2025 generation fought with petrol bottles and machetes in front of doorbell cameras directed from a Gulf apartment by a man on encrypted messaging, and they were taken down by tower records, vehicle hires, doorbell footage, and an international warrant chain that reached Dubai, Bahrain, and Indonesia in turn. The methods were different. The lesson was the same. Both generations had assumed, in their own way, that visibility could be managed. The 2006 generation assumed masks and silence would hold the line. The 2025 generation assumed encryption and distance would hold a different line. Neither assumption held. Both sets of operators left enough trace in enough places that the system eventually caught up. That is what both wars prove. A criminal organisation that operates inside a country with functioning courts, functioning police forces, doorbell cameras on every street, and international extradition treaties is an organisation living on borrowed time. The clock runs differently for each generation, but the clock runs. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.